The courtroom fell into a silence so complete that Sarah Martinez could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears like distant artillery fire. Judge Harrison's gavel rested motionless in his weathered hand, suspended above the mahogany bench, as if time itself had frozen. The words he'd just spoken hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield, words that would seal her fate with the finality of a coffin lid. Sarah Elena Martinez, having been found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Colonel James Blackwood, this court sentences you to death by lethal injection. The gallery behind her erupted in a mixture of gasps, muted sobs, and the satisfied murmurs of those who believed justice had finally been served. But Sarah heard none of it. Her world had narrowed to a single point of focus, the massive German shepherd sitting beside her wheelchair, his intelligent amber eyes fixed not on the judge, not on the crowd, but on something or someone in the back of the courtroom. Kaiser's hackles weren't raised, but Sarah knew that look. She'd seen it in Afghanistan when he'd detected IEDs buried beneath the desert sand, when he'd sensed Taliban fighters hiding in seemingly empty compounds. It was the look of a warrior who'd found his target. "Ma'am, we need to—" The bailiff's voice cut through her thoughts, his hand moving toward the restraints that would bind her wrists for the journey to death row. But Kaiser moved first. The 85-pound shepherd rose to his feet with the fluid grace of a predator, placing himself between Sarah and the approaching officer. He didn't growl, didn't bare his teeth. He simply stood there, immovable as a mountain, his gaze still locked on whatever had captured his attention in the gallery. "Kaiser, down," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse from 3 weeks of testimony. That had painted her as a cold-blooded killer. The dog's ears twitched at her command, but he didn't move. For the first time in 8 years of unwavering obedience, her faithful companion was refusing a direct order. Judge Harrison leaned forward, his bushy eyebrows knitting together in annoyance. "Bailiff Morrison, remove that animal from my courtroom, immediately." "Yes, Your Honor." Morrison approached cautiously, his hand resting on his taser. "Here, boy, come on." Kaiser's head turned slowly toward the bailiff, and Morrison stopped mid-step. There was something in the dog's expression, not aggression, but a kind of desperate intelligence, as if he was trying to communicate something urgent that his human companions were too blind to see. Sarah's court-appointed attorney, a tired-looking public defender named Phillips, gathered his papers with the resigned efficiency of a man who'd lost more cases than he'd won. "I'm sorry, Sarah. We'll file the appeal, but he knows something." Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the courtroom chatter like a blade. "Kaiser knows something." Phillips paused, his hand hovering over his briefcase. In 3 weeks of preparation and trial, this was the first time his client had shown any real emotion beyond resigned acceptance. "Sarah, the dog is just confused. The stress—" "No." Sarah's brown eyes, dulled by months of imprisonment and the crushing weight of betrayal, suddenly blazed with the intensity that had once made her one of the Army's most decorated K-9 handlers. "You don't understand. Kaiser doesn't get confused. He doesn't make mistakes. If he's acting like this, there's a reason." As if responding to her words, Kaiser took 3 deliberate steps toward the gallery, his nose twitching as he tested the hair. The crowd began to murmur and shift, some people rising from their seats to get a better look at the drama unfolding in front of the judge's bench. "Bailiff Morrison!" Judge Harrison's voice boomed through the courtroom. "I said remove that animal." But as Morrison approached again, Kaiser did something that made every person in that room freeze in place. He sat down directly in front of the witness stand and released a sound that was part whine, part howl, a mournful cry that seemed to carry the weight of every battlefield, every fallen soldier, every injustice that had ever stained the halls of justice. It was the same sound he'd made in Kandahar province when they'd found Lieutenant Rodriguez's body, 3 days after the ambush that was supposed to have been a routine patrol. The same sound he'd made when they'd lowered the flag-draped coffin of Sergeant Kowalski, Kaiser's previous handler, into the frozen ground of Arlington National Cemetery. It was the sound of a dog who'd witnessed too much death, too much betrayal, and who was now watching it happen again. Sarah felt tears she'd thought were long dried up begin to burn behind her eyes. "He's trying to tell us something," she said, her voice breaking. "Please, just listen to him. But Judge Harrison had heard enough. "Bailiff Morrison, if you cannot control that animal, call animal control. I will not have my courtroom turned into a circus." As Morrison reached for his radio, Kaiser's howl died away to a whimper. He looked back at Sarah one last time, his amber eyes full of a pain that seemed almost human. Then he lay down, resting his massive head on his paws, but his gaze never wavered from whatever had captured his attention in the gallery. The bailiff snapped the restraints around Sarah's wrists with practiced efficiency, the metal cold against her skin. As they prepared to wheel her toward the door that would lead to the transport van, to death row, to the final chapter of a life that had been devoted to serving her country, Sarah took one last look at her faithful companion. "I'm sorry, boy," she whispered. "I'm so sorry I couldn't understand." But as the courtroom doors swung shut behind her, Sarah didn't see Kaiser rise to his feet again, didn't see him pad slowly toward the gallery where a man in an expensive suit was gathering his papers with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. She didn't see the way the dog's nostrils flared as he caught a scent that made his entire body go rigid with recognition, a scent that carried memories of desert sand, gunpowder, and betrayal, a scent that belonged to a ghost who should have been dead, but who had instead orchestrated the downfall of the woman who'd once saved his life. 8 years earlier, Kandahar province, Afghanistan. The explosion had torn through the morning air, like the fist of an angry god, sending shockwaves that rattled windows 3 miles away from the forward operating base. Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez felt the blast in her bones, felt it in the way her teeth ached, and her vision blurred for a split second before training kicked in. "High ED on Route Sabre." The radio crackled with the voice of Lieutenant Danny Rodriguez, her best friend since basic training, and the closest thing to a brother she'd ever had. "We've got casualties, multiple casualties." Sarah was already moving, her hand instinctively reaching for the tactical harness that would connect her to Kaiser, the 2-year-old German shepherd who'd been her partner for exactly 14 days. The dog was still green, still learning to trust her commands, but he had something that couldn't be taught, an almost supernatural ability to detect danger. "Martinez," Colonel Blackwood's voice boomed across the compound. "At 38, James." Blackwood was the kind of officer who led from the front, who ate the same MREs as his soldiers, and never asked them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. "Take your dog and get out there. Rodriguez's convoy is pinned down, and we need to know if the route's clear for medevac." Sarah nodded, clipping Kaiser's lead to her belt. The shepherd looked up at her with those intelligent amber eyes, sensing the urgency in her movements. "You ready, boy? Time to earn your kibble." The ride to the ambush site took 12 minutes, that felt like 12 hours. Kaiser sat beside her in the Humvee, his head out the window, his nose working to pass the dozens of scents that painted a picture of the Afghan landscape. Dust, diesel fuel, cooking fires, fear, and something else, something metallic and sharp. That made his hackles rise. They found Rodriguez's convoy scattered across a quarter-mile stretch of road, 3 vehicles disabled by the initial blast, and 2 more damaged by small arms fire from Taliban fighters who'd melted back into the rocky hills like smoke. The medevac helicopter circled overhead, its pilot unwilling to land until the route was confirmed clear of additional explosives. "Sarah," Rodriguez limped toward her, his left leg darkened with blood below the knee. "Thank God you're here. We've got 2 KIA and 3 wounded, but I think there's more ordnance out there. My guys are spooked. They're seeing IEDs behind every rock." Sarah knelt beside Kaiser, unclipping his lead and running her hands over his head in the ritual that meant they were about to work. "Find them, boy, find the bad ones." Kaiser's transformation was immediate and complete. The friendly, tail-wagging companion disappeared, replaced by a focused instrument of war, whose entire world narrowed to the scents and sounds that might mean death for the soldiers around him. He began working the area in a systematic grid pattern, his nose close to the ground, his body language communicating everything Sarah needed to know. 20 feet from the disabled lead vehicle, Kaiser stopped. His body went rigid, one front paw raised in the classic pointing stance that meant he'd found something. Sarah felt her heart sink. There was another bomb, probably command detonated, waiting for the medevac to land. "Got one," she called back. To Rodriguez. 40 meters north of your position. But as the EOD team moved in to disable the device, Kaiser's behavior changed. Instead of moving on to continue his search, he began pacing in tight circles, his agitation growing by the second. Sarah had never seen him act like this. It was as if he'd detected something that his training hadn't prepared him for. "What is it, boy?" She moved closer, trusting the dog's instincts even when she couldn't understand them. "What do you smell?" Kaiser's answer came in the form of a sudden sprint toward a cluster of rocks 30 meters to the east. Sarah followed, her M4 at the ready, Rodriguez limping behind her despite his wounded leg. They found the body wedged between two boulders, partially concealed by a military-issue poncho. It was Sergeant First Class Michael Chen, Rodriguez's radio operator, who'd been listed as missing since the initial blast. But it wasn't the Taliban who'd killed him. The bullet wound in the back of his head was from an M9 pistol, standard U.S. Army issue. "Jesus Christ," Rodriguez whispered, his face going pale beneath his desert tan. Mike was executed. By one of our own. Sarah stared at the body, her mind racing through the implications. Chen had been the only survivor in the lead vehicle, the only witness to what had happened in those first chaotic moments after the IED detonated. Someone had made sure he'd never tell that story. Kaiser whined softly, his nose twitching as he caught another scent trail leading away from the body. But before Sarah could follow it, the crack of a rifle shot echoed across the valley, and Rodriguez crumpled to the ground beside her, a red stain spreading across his desert fatigues. "Sniper!" Sarah dove for cover, pulling Kaiser with her as more shots peppered the rocks around them. But these weren't random shots from Taliban fighters. They were too precise, too well-aimed. Someone was trying to silence everyone who'd seen Chen's body. The firefight lasted 40 minutes. When it was over, Rodriguez was dead. 2 more soldiers had been killed, and Sarah Martinez was the only witness left alive to the fact that Sergeant Chen had been murdered by someone wearing an American uniform. She never saw the figure watching from the hilltop above, never saw the expensive scope that had tracked her movements throughout the battle, never knew how close she'd come to joining her best friend in death. Kaiser knew, though. His hackles had stayed raised long after the last shot was fired, his amber eyes scanning the hills for a threat that smelled familiar, a scent he would remember for the rest of his life. Present day. County Jail. Sarah jerked, awake in her cell, the echo of Rodriguez's voice still ringing in her ears. It had been the same nightmare for 8 years now, the same sequence of events that had led to her receiving the Silver Star for valor, and Kaiser receiving a commendation for his service in detecting the IEDs that would have killed the medevac. Cruz. What the official report didn't mention was Chen's execution, or the sniper who'd tried to kill everyone who'd witnessed it. The army had labeled it a Taliban ambush, case closed, and when Sarah had tried to push for a deeper investigation, she'd been told that the stress of combat was affecting her judgment. Only Colonel Blackwood had believed her. Only he had listened. When she described the American-made bullet that had killed Chen, the precision of the sniper fire, the way Kaiser had reacted to scents that suggested betrayal from within their own ranks, that was why his murder had destroyed her world so completely. James Blackwood had been more than her commanding officer. He'd been the father figure she'd never had, the man who'd helped her process the trauma of losing Rodriguez, the officer who'd fought to get her the medical care she'd needed when an IED explosion 2 years later had left her paralyzed from the waist down. And now they said she'd killed him, shot him 3 times in the chest in his own home, then tried to make it look like a robbery. The evidence was overwhelming. Her fingerprints on the murder weapon, her DNA under his fingernails, security footage that showed her van in his driveway on the night he died. But Sarah knew she'd been in her apartment that night 14 miles away, watching old war movies with Kaiser and trying not to think about the anniversary of Rodriguez's death. She remembered every detail of that evening because it had been one of the few peaceful nights she'd had in months. The problem was that no one believed her. Not the police, not her lawyer, not even some of her old army buddies who testified about her unstable behavior since returning from Afghanistan. The prosecution had painted a picture of a bitter, disabled veteran who'd blamed her commanding officer for the injuries that had ended her military career. Only Kaiser knew the truth. Only he had been there with her that night, had seen her never leave the apartment, had witnessed her shock and grief when the police had arrived with a warrant for her arrest. But dogs couldn't testify in court. Dogs couldn't tell a jury about the scent they'd detected in that courtroom, the familiar smell of a man who should have been dead, who had orchestrated the perfect frame job from beyond the grave. Sarah pressed her face against the small window of her cell, looking out at the exercise yard where a few inmates were shooting basketball in the fading afternoon light. Tomorrow, she would be transferred to death row at the state penitentiary. In 18 months, barring a miracle appeal, she would be strapped to a gurney and given a lethal injection for a crime she didn't commit. But somewhere in the city, Kaiser was still working, still following his nose, still protecting the woman who'd saved his life in the mountains of Afghanistan, the dog who'd never forgotten a scent, never given up on a mission, never stopped believing in the truth. He was her only hope now. Her only chance for justice in a world that had forgotten what loyalty really meant. 3 days after sentencing, Riverside County Animal Control Facility, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead like angry wasps as Animal Control Officer Janet Reeves made her morning rounds through the kennels. She'd been doing this job for 12 years, long enough to recognize the difference between a dog that was simply scared and one that was genuinely dangerous. But Kaiser Martinez fell into neither category. The massive German shepherd sat in the corner of Kennel 47, his amber eyes tracking her every movement with an intelligence that made Janet's skin crawl. He wasn't aggressive, hadn't so much as growled at any of the staff, but there was something unsettling about the way he watched everything, as if he was cataloguing details for some future purpose. "Still won't eat," said Tommy Nguyen, the newest addition to their staff, as he hung fresh water bowls on the kennel doors. "Been 3 days now. Dr. Morrison thinks he's depressed." Janet paused in front of Kaiser's kennel, studying the untouched bowl of kibble that had been sitting there since yesterday morning. The dog's weight was already dropping. She could see the definition of his ribs beneath his thick coat. If he didn't start eating soon, they'd have to consider force-feeding or IV nutrition. "He's not depressed," she said quietly, more to herself than to Tommy. "He's waiting." Waiting for what? Before Janet could answer, Kaiser rose to his feet and moved to the front of the kennel. But he wasn't looking at them. His attention was focused on something beyond the concrete walls, his head tilted in the listening posture that working dogs adopted when they detected a specific sound frequency. "What is it, boy?" Janet knelt down, extending her hand through the chain-link door. Kaiser sniffed her fingers politely but didn't make contact. His entire body remained tense, alert, as if he expected someone to walk through the door at any moment. The front buzzer rang, echoing through the facility's cinder-block corridors. Janet checked her watch, 9:15 a.m., too early for most walk-in adoptions. Through the window, she could see a black sedan parked in the visitor space, its tinted windows making it impossible to see who was inside. "I'll get it," Tommy said, heading toward the front desk. But as his footsteps faded down the hallway, Kaiser's behavior changed dramatically. The German shepherd began pacing the length of his kennel, his movements sharp and agitated. A low whine escaped his throat, not the sound of a sad dog, but something more urgent, more warning-like. Janet had seen enough military and police dogs during her career to recognize the signs. Kaiser wasn't reacting to random stimuli. He was responding to a specific threat that his training had programmed him to detect. "Holy shit," she whispered, pulling out her cell phone to call Dr. Morrison. But before she could dial, Tommy's voice, carried back from the front office, professional and cheerful. "Good morning, sir. How can I help you today?" The response was too quiet for Janet to make out, but Kaiser's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. The dog threw himself against the kennel door with such force that the entire structure shook, his claws scrabbling for purchase on the concrete floor as he tried to break free. His bark was deep, commanding, the sound of a war dog alerting his handler to incoming danger. Janet ran toward the front office, her heart pounding with sudden adrenaline. She found Tommy behind the reception desk, his face pale as he stared at the man standing in the doorway. The visitor was in his 50s, well-dressed in an expensive suit with the kind of bearing that suggested military background. His hair was silver grey, perfectly styled, and his smile was warm and paternal, but his eyes were wrong, cold, calculating eyes that didn't match the friendly expression on his face. "I'm sorry about the noise," Janet said, slightly out of breath. "One of our dogs is having a bad day. How can we help you?" The man's smile widened, showing perfect teeth. "I'm here about the German Shepherd, the one that belonged to Sarah Martinez." Janet felt her stomach drop. "I'm sorry, sir, but that animal isn't available for adoption. He's been classified as—" "Oh, I'm not here to adopt him." The man reached into his jacket, and for a split second, Janet's hand moved instinctively toward the panic button under the reception desk, but he only pulled out a leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a badge and identification card. "Special Agent Marcus Webb, Department of Defense Criminal Investigation Division. I need to examine the animal as part of an ongoing investigation." Tommy leaned forward to get a better look at the credentials, but Janet stepped between them. Something about this felt wrong. The timing was too convenient, the man's demeanor too smooth. In her experience, federal agents didn't usually show up unannounced at animal shelters, asking about dogs whose owners had just been sentenced to death. "I'll need to call my supervisor," she said carefully. "And I'll need to see those credentials." Again, Webb's smile faltered for just a moment, a flash of irritation crossing his features before the friendly mask slipped back into place. "Of course. Take all the time you need." But as Janet reached for the phone, Kaiser's barking intensified, becoming a continuous roar of rage and warning that made the windows rattle. Other dogs throughout the facility began picking up the alarm, adding their voices to the cacophony until the entire building seemed to vibrate with canine fury. Webb's hand moved to his jacket again, this time staying there. "Perhaps we could move somewhere quieter to discuss this?" Janet's finger hovered over the panic button. Everything about this situation screamed danger. The mysterious federal agent, the perfect timing, the way Kaiser was reacting like he detected an enemy combatant. But before she could make a decision, the front door burst open and 3 uniformed sheriff's deputies rushed in, their hands on their weapons. Sheriff's Department. The lead deputy, a woman in her 40s with sergeant's stripes, surveyed the scene with professional calm. "We received a report of suspicious activity." Webb turned to face the new arrivals, his movements slow and deliberate. "Special Agent Webb, DOD Criminal Investigation. I was just explaining to these folks that I need to examine evidence related to the Martinez case." The sergeant's eyes narrowed. "Agent Webb, we weren't notified of any federal involvement in this case. Could I see some identification?" As Webb reached for his wallet again, Janet noticed something that made her blood run cold. The man's jacket had ridden up slightly during his movements, revealing the grip of a pistol in a shoulder holster. Federal agents were armed, of course, but there was something about the way this weapon sat, something about the worn leather of the holster, that suggested it had seen recent use. "There seems to be some confusion," Webb said, his voice still pleasant, but with an edge of steel underneath. "I can assure you that my presence here is completely legitimate." But the sergeant was already speaking into her radio, calling for backup and requesting verification of Webb's credentials. As she did, Kaiser's barking reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. The sound wasn't random. It was a specific cadence, a pattern that Janet suddenly recognized from her brief time training with military working dogs. It was an alert bark, the sound a combat dog made when he'd identified a high-value target. Webb's mask finally slipped completely. His hand dropped to his weapon, his body language shifting from bureaucratic politeness to predatory readiness. "I think there's been enough talking." But before he could clear leather, the sergeant's taser caught him in the chest, 50,000 volts dropping him to the linoleum floor like a marionette with cut strings. As he convulsed, his wallet fell open, revealing identification. That wasn't for Marcus Webb at all. The name on the military ID was Lieutenant Colonel Michael Chen, a man who had supposedly died in Afghanistan 8 years ago, executed by an unknown assailant in the rocky hills of Kandahar province. As the deputies secured the scene and called for more backup, Janet stood in stunned silence, listening to Kaiser's barks gradually subside into satisfied whines. The dog had recognized his enemy, had tried to warn them, had done everything in his power to protect them from a ghost who'd returned to finish what he'd started in the desert. But the most chilling realization was still to come. If Michael Chen was alive, if he'd been living under a false identity for 8 years, then everything about Sarah Martinez's case was built on a lie. The woman sitting on death row was innocent, framed by a man who'd faked his own death to escape justice for his crimes in Afghanistan. And the only witness who could prove it was a German shepherd, whose testimony would never be heard in a court of law. That evening, Sheriff's Department interview room detective Ray Coleman had been working homicide for 15 years, long enough to know that the weird cases were always the ones that kept him up at night. The man currently sitting in interview room 3 was definitely going to cost him some sleep. Michael Chen, not Marcus Webb, as his fake credentials had claimed, sat at the metal table with his lawyer, a high-priced defense attorney named Richard Strand, who'd driven down from Los Angeles as soon as the arrest hit the wire. Chen hadn't said a word since they'd read him his rights, but his eyes held the kind of cold intelligence that Coleman associated with career criminals and sociopaths. "Let me see if I've got this straight," Coleman said, flipping through the file that had been faxed over from the Pentagon. "According to Army records, you died in Afghanistan 8 years ago, shot in the head by person or persons unknown during a Taliban ambush. Purple Heart, Bronze Star, the whole 9 yards. Your family held a funeral. There's a headstone with your name on it in Arlington National Cemetery." Chen's lawyer leaned forward. "My client isn't required to—" "But here you are," Coleman continued, ignoring the interruption, "very much alive, carrying fake federal credentials and trying to gain access to a dog whose owner just got sentenced to death for murdering your former commanding officer. That's one hell of a coincidence, don't you think?" Chen's expression didn't change, but Coleman caught a flicker of something, amusement maybe, or contempt. This wasn't a man who was worried about being caught. He was a man who was annoyed at being inconvenienced. A knock on the door interrupted Coleman's thoughts. Sergeant Patricia Vance stuck her head in, her face grim. "Detective, we need to talk now." Coleman left Chen with a uniformed officer and followed Vance down the hallway to her office. The sergeant closed the door behind them and pulled out a thick manila folder that looked like it had been through a war zone. "I called in some favors with my old contacts at CID, Vance said, spreading photographs across her desk. "Took some digging, but I found the original case file from Chen's supposed death. And Coleman, this thing stinks worse than a 3-day-old fish." The photographs showed the rocky outcropping where Chen's body had allegedly been found, the bullet, wound that had supposedly killed him, the military funeral that had honored his sacrifice. But as Coleman studied the images, details began jumping out at him that didn't make sense. "Look at the blood spatter," Vance said, pointing to one of the crime scene photos. "Wrong angle for a close-range execution, and here—" She indicated another image showing Chen's dog tags. "The metal's too clean, no oxidation, no wear marks, like they were planted after the fact." Coleman picked up the autopsy report, his frown deepening as he read. "Says here the body was too damaged by the explosion to allow for positive identification. DNA testing was inconclusive due to extreme thermal damage to tissue samples," which is Army speak for, "We couldn't prove this was actually Michael Chen, but we needed to close the case," Vance translated. But here's the interesting part. The investigating officer who signed off on Chen's death, Colonel James Blackwood. The name hit Coleman like a physical blow. The same James Blackwood that Sarah Martinez supposedly murdered. The very same. And get this, Blackwood tried to reopen Chen's case 3 times over the past 8 years. Each time he was told to drop it by higher-ups in the Pentagon. The last request was filed 6 months ago, just 2 weeks before he was killed. Coleman sank into a chair, his mind racing through the implications. So Chen fakes his own death in Afghanistan, probably to cover up some kind of crime or betrayal. Blackwood figures it out years later and starts pushing for a new investigation. Chen eliminates Blackwood and frames Sarah Martinez because she was the one person who might have been able to corroborate Blackwood's suspicions. That's my read on it, Vance agreed. But proving it is going to be another story entirely. Chen's been living under multiple identities for 8 years. He's got money, connections, and a lot of practice at staying invisible. Plus, Martinez's case is already decided. She's been sentenced to death. The state's not going to want to hear that they got it wrong. Coleman stood up, pacing to the window that looked out over the sheriff's department parking lot. In the distance, he could see the lights of the county jail, where Sarah Martinez was spending her last few days before transfer to death row. An innocent woman, if their theory was correct, paying the price for a dead man's crimes. What about the dog? He asked suddenly. Chen was specifically trying to get to Martinez's dog. Why? Vance pulled out another photograph, this one showing Kaiser in his army working harness, alert and focused as he searched for IEDs in the Afghan desert. According to his service record, this dog has an almost perfect detection rate. Never had a false positive, never missed a threat. Military working dogs can be trained to identify specific individuals by scent, and once they lock onto a target, they never forget. You think Kaiser recognized Chen's scent? Even after 8 years? Dogs can remember scents for decades, Vance said. And if Chen was at the original crime scene in Afghanistan, if he was the one who executed his own radio operator to cover up whatever he was really doing out there, then Kaiser would have catalogued his scent as a threat. When he saw Chen in that courtroom today, he knew exactly who he was looking at. Coleman felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place in his mind. That's why Chen wanted access to the dog. Not to examine evidence, to eliminate the one witness who could identify him. A witness whose testimony would never be questioned because he's a decorated military working dog with an impeccable service record. Exactly. And if we're right about this, then Chen has probably been planning Martinez's frame-up for months, maybe years. He's had time to plant evidence, establish alibis, create a narrative that would convince a jury. The only thing he didn't to account for was the dog recognizing him in court. A new voice cut through their conversation. Actually, he did account for that. Coleman and Vance turned to see a woman standing in the doorway, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, her pantsuit expensive but understated. She held herself with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, and when she spoke, it was with the quiet authority of someone who expected to be obeyed. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but this is a restricted area," Coleman said, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. You'll need to. Brigadier General Patricia Hayes, Army Criminal Investigation Command, the woman said, producing identification that looked far more legitimate than Chen's fake credentials had. I've been tracking Michael Chen for 3 years, ever since we discovered evidence that he'd been selling intelligence to the Taliban before his supposed death. Vance leaned back in her chair, her expression skeptical. And you just happened to show up here tonight? That's awfully convenient. Hayes smiled, tightly. Detective, when a dead traitor surfaces after 8 years and tries to eliminate the one witness who can identify him, it tends to get our attention pretty quickly. We've been monitoring Chen's activities since he surfaced in Los Angeles 6 months ago. We know about the bank accounts, the safe houses, the weapons cache he's been accumulating. You've been watching him for 6 months and didn't arrest him? Coleman's voice rose with incredulous anger. A woman is sitting on death row because of this man. And you people have been playing some kind of intelligence game. We needed proof, Hayes said simply. Chen is smart, careful, and paranoid. He's covered his tracks well, and most of the evidence of his original crimes was destroyed when he faked his death. Sarah Martinez's case was the first time he'd made a mistake, left himself exposed. We were hoping he'd lead us to his accomplices, the network that helped him disappear. What accomplices? Vance asked. Hayes opened her own file folder, revealing surveillance photographs of Chen meeting with various individuals in parking garages, hotel lobbies, and remote locations. Chen didn't fake his death alone. Someone in the Pentagon helped. Him provided new identification, covered up the inconsistencies in his case file. Someone with enough rank and influence to make sure questions weren't asked and investigations were shut down. Coleman studied the photographs, noting the careful way they'd been taken from long distances with telephoto lenses. You think Blackwood was getting close to identifying Chen's inside man. That's why he had to be eliminated. We're certain of it. 3 days before his death, Blackwood contacted our office requesting a meeting. He said he had evidence that would expose a conspiracy that went all the way to the top of the Army's command structure. He was killed before we could arrange that meeting. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about one rogue soldier faking his death. It was about corruption at the highest levels of the military, about a network of traitors who'd been operating for years, selling secrets and eliminating anyone who got too close to the truth. "What happens now?" Coleman asked finally. Hayes closed her file folder and stood up. "Now we make sure Michael Chen never sees the outside of a federal prison, and we make sure Sarah Martinez gets the justice she deserves, even if it means burning down half the Pentagon to do it." But as the general left the room, Coleman couldn't shake the feeling that they were still missing something important. Chen was smart, methodical, and had been planning this for years. Would he really have made such an obvious mistake as showing up at the animal shelter himself? Or was this just another layer of the deception, another move in a game that was far from over? The next morning, Death Row Transport, the armored transport van, cut through the morning traffic like a funeral procession, its black paint job and heavily tinted windows marking it as government property of the most serious kind. Inside, Sarah Martinez sat shackled to a reinforced bench, her wrists cuffed to a chain around her waist, her ankles bound together with restraints that left barely enough slack for shuffling steps. Across from her sat 2 federal marshals, their faces professionally blank, as they monitored their prisoner for signs of distress or escape attempts. Sarah had given them neither. She'd been quiet and compliant since they'd loaded her into the van at dawn, her dark eyes focused on some distant point beyond the bulletproof windows. But inside her chest, her heart was hammering with a mixture of hope and terror that threatened to overwhelm her careful composure. The news had reached her cell at 5 a.m. Michael Chen was alive in custody and being questioned about Colonel Blackwood's murder. Her conviction was under review. Her execution stayed pending investigation of new evidence. It should have been the best news of her life. Instead, it felt 2 hours later, FBI Regional Office, Los Angeles. The conference room smelled of stale coffee and desperation, its fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across the faces of the assembled law enforcement officials. Sarah Martinez sat at the head of the long table, her wheelchair positioned between her court-appointed attorney and a new face, Special Agent Diana Reeves from the FBI's Domestic Terrorism Unit, a woman whose reputation for tenacity was matched only by her record of closing impossible cases. Across from them, Brigadier General Hayes spread out a collection of photographs, documents, and audio recordings that represented 3 years of painstaking investigation into what the Army was now calling Operation Lazarus, a conspiracy that had sold American intelligence to the Taliban and orchestrated the deaths of at least 17 soldiers to cover its tracks. "Michael Chen was never the mastermind," Hayes began, her voice carrying the weight of hard-won knowledge. "He was a foot soldier, a greedy opportunist who got in over his head. The real architect of this operation is someone who's been hiding in plain sight for 8 years, someone who helped Chen fake his death, and then used him as a weapon to eliminate anyone who got too close to the truth." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the water glass in front of her. "Colonel Blackwood knew, didn't he? That's why he had to die." "Your commanding officer was a good man and a thorough investigator," Hayes replied. 6 months before his death, he'd connected Chen's supposed execution to a pattern of intelligence leaks that had gotten American soldiers killed. He was building a case, gathering evidence, preparing to expose not just Chen but the entire network that had protected him. Agent Reeves leaned forward, her gray eyes intense. The problem was that James Blackwood trusted the wrong person. He shared his findings with someone he believed was helping him investigate the conspiracy. Instead, he was signing his own death warrant. The room fell silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of Los Angeles traffic. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as the implications became clear. Someone in the Army betrayed him, someone he trusted. Not just someone, Hayes said grimly. Someone with enough rank and influence to access classified files, to manipulate investigations, to make sure that questions weren't asked and evidence disappeared. Someone who's been playing both sides of this game from the very beginning. She pulled out a thick manila folder and extracted a series of photographs that made Sarah's blood run cold. They showed Colonel Blackwood's house on the night of his murder. But these weren't the official crime scene photos that had been presented at her trial. These were surveillance images, taken from a distance with high-powered telephoto lenses, showing figures moving through the darkness around the colonel's property. These were taken by a private investigator that Blackwood hired to watch his back, Hayes explained. He'd been receiving death threats for weeks, anonymous calls warning him to drop his investigation. He knew he was in danger, but he didn't know who to trust within the military hierarchy. Sarah studied the photographs, her heart sinking as she recognized the tactical precision of the operation. This wasn't a random burglary gone wrong. It was a professional hit, carried out by people with military training and access to sophisticated equipment. The first figure enters the property at 11:47 p.m., Hayes continued, pointing to a timestamp in the corner of one image. Note the way he moves, the equipment he's carrying. This is someone with special operations background, someone who knows how to neutralize security systems and eliminate targets without leaving evidence. The next photograph showed a second figure approaching the house, this one smaller and more cautious. The second operative arrives 12 minutes later, carrying what appears to be a forensics kit. Their job was to plant evidence that would frame you for the murder. Sarah's attorney, Phillips, leaned forward to examine the images more closely. These photographs prove my client's innocence. Why weren't they presented at trial? Because they disappeared from the private investigator's office 3 days after Blackwood's murder, Agent Reeves said. Someone broke in, stole his computer, his files, his backup drives. The PI was found dead in his car a week later, apparent suicide. These copies only survived because he'd sent them to a secure server as insurance. Sarah felt sick to her stomach as the scope of the conspiracy became apparent. How many people died to cover this up? At least 23 that we can confirm, Hayes replied. Soldiers who asked the wrong questions, investigators who got too close to the truth, witnesses who saw things they shouldn't have seen. Your case was just the latest in a long series of carefully orchestrated eliminations. But as devastating as these revelations were, Sarah found herself focused on a different question. Where's Kaiser? Is he safe? The two federal agents exchanged glances and Sarah felt her heart sink. Tell me, she said quietly. Whatever happened, I need to know. Agent Reeves pulled out her phone and showed Sarah a video feed from the county animal shelter. The image showed Kaiser in his kennel, but something was wrong. The proud, alert German shepherd she remembered had been replaced by a dog that looked broken, defeated. He lay on his side, his breathing shallow, his eyes dull with what looked like despair. He's been refusing food and water for 4 days, Reeves explained. The veterinarian says there's nothing physically wrong with him, but he's shutting down. It's like he's given up hope. Sarah pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a sob. Kaiser had always been empathically connected to her emotions, had always reflected her mental state in his own behavior. If he was dying, it was because he believed she was lost to him forever. I need to see him, she said desperately. Please, he's the only family I have left. If I don't get to him soon, he's going to die of grief. Hayes and Reeves exchanged another look, this one carrying a weight of unspoken communication. Finally, Hayes nodded. There's something else you need to know. Something that changes everything about this case. She pulled out a final photograph, this one showing a man in military dress uniform standing at attention during what appeared to be an awards ceremony. Sarah recognized the setting, the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes, where the nation's most decorated soldiers received their highest honors. But it was the face in the photograph that made her world tilt on its axis. Standing at the podium, pinning a medal on the chest of a young sergeant, was a man she knew as well as her own reflection. A man who had been her mentor, her protector, her father figure for the 8 years since Afghanistan. A man who had supposedly been the victim of her murderous rage. Colonel James Blackwood, Hayes said quietly, died in Afghanistan 8 years ago. The man you knew, the man who was murdered in his home 6 months ago, was actually Lieutenant Colonel David Morrison, Chen's original commanding officer, the man who discovered the intelligence leaks and was supposed to have died in the same ambush that supposedly killed Chen. Sarah's mind reeled as the implications crashed over her like a tsunami. Morrison took Blackwood's identity. After the ambush, Morrison was critically wounded and presumed dead. Chen and his conspirators saw an opportunity. They could eliminate two problems at once. Chen would die and disappear, while Morrison would be given a new identity and a new life, with the understanding that he would never investigate the conspiracy or threaten their operations. But Morrison wasn't content to just disappear. Agent Reeves continued. He spent 8 years building a new life as James Blackwood, earning promotions, gaining trust, positioning himself to eventually expose the people who had destroyed his unit and killed his soldiers. When he finally made his move, they eliminated him and framed the one person who might have been able to support his investigation. Sarah felt as if the ground had been pulled out from under her. Everything she thought she knew about her relationship with Colonel Blackwood had been a lie. The man she'd trusted, the father figure who had helped her through her darkest moments, had been living under a stolen identity, carrying the weight of his own supposed death. "He never told you," Hayes said gently. "Because he was protecting you. He knew that if his real identity was discovered, everyone connected to him would become a target. By keeping you in the dark, he thought he was keeping you safe." But the cruelest irony was still to come. Sarah had been convicted of murdering a man who had already been dead for 8 years, while the man she'd actually known and loved, David Morrison, had died trying to get justice for soldiers who had been betrayed by their own brothers in arms. "There's more," Agent Reeves said, and Sarah wasn't sure she could handle any more revelations. "The conspiracy goes deeper than we initially thought. The person who orchestrated all of this, who helped Chen fake his death and who's been eliminating witnesses ever since, is someone you know. Someone who's been watching you, manipulating events, making sure that you would be the perfect scapegoat. When the time came." Hayes pulled out one final photograph, and Sarah felt her blood turn to ice. Standing in the background of a military ceremony, barely visible in the crowd of uniformed officers, was a face she recognized. A face that had been present at her trial, sitting in the gallery, watching as she was convicted and sentenced to death. It was her own lawyer, Phillips. 1 hour later, Federal Building parking garage, the concrete pillars of the underground parking. Garage cast long shadows in the dim fluorescent light, creating a maze of hiding spots and blind corners that made Agent Reeves nervous. She'd wanted to conduct this operation in a controlled environment, but Phillips had insisted on meeting in a location of his choosing, always a red flag when dealing with a potential suspect. Sarah sat in the passenger seat of an unmarked FBI sedan, her hands free of restraints for the first time in months, but her legs still useless, still trapped in the wheelchair that had defined her identity since Afghanistan. Beside her, General Hayes monitored radio communications with the tactical team that had surrounded the garage, their voices crackling through encrypted channels. "Target approaching from the east entrance," came the voice of Agent Morrison, the team leader. "Single vehicle matches the description. He's alone." Through the windshield, Sarah watched as Phillips's modest Honda Civic wound its way down the parking ramp, its headlights cutting through the artificial twilight. The man she'd trusted with her life, the attorney who'd supposedly been fighting for her freedom, was actually the architect of her destruction. "How long?" she asked quietly. "How long has he been planning this?" Hayes checked her earpiece and spoke into her radio microphone. "According to our investigation, Phillips has been Chen's handler for at least 5 years. He's the one who's been providing new identities, laundering money and eliminating threats to their operation. Your case was just the latest in a long series of frame jobs designed to protect their network." The Honda pulled into a parking space 30 yards away, and Phillips emerged looking exactly as he had throughout her trial, tired, overworked, and slightly rumpled. He carried a briefcase and wore the same cheap suit he'd worn to court, playing the role of the underpaid public defender to perfection. But Sarah could see the difference now that she knew what to look for. The way he moved with military precision, despite his slovenly appearance. The way his eyes constantly scanned for threats, cataloging exit routes and potential danger. The way his hand rested casually near his jacket, close to what was probably a concealed weapon. "He's good," she admitted grudgingly. "I never suspected anything." "That's what made him so dangerous," Hayes replied. "Phillips has been playing both sides for years, defending clients while secretly working to convict them, building trust while planning betrayals. He's a sociopath with law degree and military training, which makes him one of the most dangerous men we've ever pursued." Phillips approached their sedan with the careful, measured steps of a man who knew he was walking into a trap, but was confident in his ability to handle it. When he reached the driver's side window, Agent Reeves rolled it down and smiled pleasantly. "Mr. Phillips, thank you for coming. Agent Reeves, General Hayes." Phillips nodded to each of them in turn, then focused his attention on Sarah. "Ms. Martinez, I have to say you look remarkably well for someone who's supposed to be on death row." Sarah studied the man who had supposedly been her advocate, searching for any sign of the person she'd thought she knew. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why me?" Phillips smiled, and for the first time Sarah saw the cold intelligence that had been hiding behind his facade of bumbling incompetence. "Because you were perfect. A disabled veteran with PTSD, a history of violent episodes, a documented obsession with your commanding officer. When we needed someone to take the fall for Morrison's murder, you were the obvious choice." "Morrison," Sarah repeated, "not Blackwood." "Oh, you figured that out, did you?" Phillips chuckled. "David Morrison was a persistent pain in our ass. I'll give him that. We should have killed him in Afghanistan along with the rest of his unit. But Chen got sentimental. Thought maybe Morrison could be turned, convinced to join our operation. Instead, he spent 8 years building a new identity and gathering evidence against us." Agent Reeves kept her voice level, professional. "We have recordings of your conversations with Chen, financial records showing payments from Taliban sources, evidence of at least 12 murders you've orchestrated over the past 5 years. It's over, Phillips." But Phillips didn't look like a man who believed it was over. He looked like a man who was about to make his final move in a game he'd been playing for far longer than anyone realized. "You know what the beautiful thing about this whole operation has been," he said conversationally. "The fact that nobody wanted to believe it was possible. American soldiers selling out their own brothers. A decorated lawyer betraying his clients. A disabled veteran murdering her beloved commander. People would rather believe in individual evil than systemic corruption." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder, holding it up so they could see the contents. "Inside this folder are the real files from Operation Lazarus, not just the intelligence we sold to the Taliban, but the names of every American official who helped us do it. Senators, generals, CIA directors, people who've been profiting from this war for 8 years, and who will do anything to keep their involvement secret." Sarah felt her heart sink as she realized what Phillips was offering. "You want to make a deal?" "I want to make a trade," Phillips corrected. "My freedom for information that will bring down half the military-industrial complex. You can have your small victory. Chen in prison, your conviction overturned, your dog back. But the real monsters will walk free unless you're willing to let me walk too." The parking garage fell silent except for the distant hum of traffic and the soft crackle of radio communications. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, could feel the weight of an impossible choice settling on her shoulders. "There's a third option," she said quietly. Phillips raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" Sarah smiled, and for the first time in months, it was a genuine expression of joy. "Kaiser." As if summoned by his name, a low growl echoed through the concrete space. Phillips spun around, his hand moving toward his weapon, but it was too late. The German shepherd emerged from behind a concrete pillar like a ghost made flesh, his amber eyes locked on the man who had orchestrated so much death and betrayal. "How—" Phillips began, but Kaiser was already moving. The dog hit him low and hard, 85 pounds of trained muscle and fury driving him to the ground. Phillips's briefcase went flying, its contents scattering across the oil-stained concrete as he struggled to draw his weapon. But Kaiser had been trained for this exact scenario, disarming enemy combatants, neutralizing threats, protecting his handler at all costs. The gun skittered away across the floor as Phillips screamed, his cries echoing off the concrete walls. But Kaiser didn't maul him, didn't tear him apart as he could have. Instead, he simply held him down, his powerful jaws locked around Philip's wrist, his weight pressing the man's chest to the ground. "Good boy," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Good boy, Kaiser." Agent Reeves and her tactical team swarmed the scene, securing Phillips and gathering the scattered documents that would expose the full scope of the conspiracy. But Sarah only had eyes for her faithful companion, the dog who had never stopped believing in her innocence, who had somehow escaped from the animal shelter to be here when she needed him most. As the federal agents led Phillips away in handcuffs, Kaiser padded over to Sarah's wheelchair and rested his massive head on her lap. She buried her fingers in his thick fur, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing, the warmth of his body against hers. "I'm sorry I couldn't understand sooner," she whispered. "I'm sorry I couldn't hear what you were trying to tell me." Kaiser looked up at her with those intelligent amber eyes, and Sarah could swear she saw forgiveness there. Forgiveness, love, and the absolute certainty that their bond was stronger than any conspiracy, any betrayal, any injustice that mere humans could devise. 3 days later, steps of the federal courthouse. The media circus outside the courthouse was unlike anything Los Angeles had seen since the celebrity trials of the previous decade. News vans lined the street for 3 blocks in every direction, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like metallic flowers reaching for the sun. Reporters from every major network jostled for position behind the police barriers, their cameras and microphones creating a forest of technology focused on the courthouse steps. Sarah Martinez emerged from the building in her wheelchair, flanked by her new legal team, real advocates this time, not wolves in sheep's clothing. The sunlight felt alien on her face after months of fluorescent-lit cells and windowless courtrooms, but she forced herself to sit up straight as the cameras captured her first moments of freedom. Beside her, Kaiser walked with the disciplined bearing of the military working dog he'd always been, but there was something different in his posture now. The desperate alertness that had marked his behavior during the trial was gone, replaced by a calm confidence that suggested he knew his mission was complete. "Ladies and gentlemen," began District Attorney Patricia Walsh, stepping up to the microphone cluster that had been set up for the press conference. 3 days ago, the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office received evidence that fundamentally changed our understanding of the murder of Colonel James Blackwood, or as we now know him, Lieutenant Colonel David Morrison. The crowd of reporters erupted in a cacophony of shouted questions, but Walsh raised her hand for silence. "The evidence we've uncovered reveals a conspiracy that reaches to the highest levels of military command, a network of traitors who sold American intelligence to our enemies and murdered anyone who threatened to expose them." Sarah watched the faces in the crowd, seeing the mixture of shock, fascination, and skepticism that greeted Walsh's words. The full story of Operation Lazarus was almost too incredible to believe. Dead soldiers who weren't dead, lawyers who were assassins. A disabled veteran framed for a murder she couldn't have committed. "Ms. Martinez," called out a reporter from CNN, "how do you feel about the fact that your own attorney was working to convict you?" Sarah leaned forward toward the microphones, her voice steady despite the emotion churning in her chest. "I feel grateful that the truth finally came out, and I feel proud that American justice, however flawed, eventually found its way to the right conclusion. But mostly, I feel sad for all the soldiers who died because of this conspiracy, and for their families who never knew the real reason their loved ones were killed." "What about your dog?" asked another reporter. "There are reports that Kaiser somehow escaped from the animal shelter to help capture Phillips. Can you explain what happened?" Sarah smiled and reached down to scratch behind Kaiser's ears. The German shepherd's tail wagged slightly, the first sign of real happiness she'd seen from him in months. "Kaiser is a military working dog with 8 years of combat experience. He's trained to escape from restraints, to track targets across hostile territory, and to protect his handler at all costs. When he realized I was in danger, he did what he'd been trained to do." What she didn't say, what she couldn't prove but knew in her heart to be true, was that Kaiser had done something beyond his training. He'd somehow understood that she needed him at that exact moment, had felt her desperation across the miles that separated them, and had found a way to be there when everything else had fallen apart. "Will you be seeking compensation from the military for the wrongful prosecution?" asked a reporter from the Washington Post. "My client will be pursuing all available legal remedies," interrupted her new attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Rebecca Stone, who specialized in military justice cases. "The Army's negligence in this matter led to 8 years of preventable deaths, including the murder of Lieutenant Colonel Morrison and the attempted execution of an innocent woman. There will be accountability." But Sarah was already thinking beyond legal remedies and financial compensation. The real damage of Operation Lazarus couldn't be undone by court settlements or congressional hearings. 17 soldiers were still dead, their families still grieving, their sacrifices still tainted by the betrayal of their own brothers in arms. "Ms. Martinez," called out a reporter from Fox News, "do you have any message for other veterans who might be watching this?" Sarah took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "I want them to know that the system failed me, but it didn't defeat me. I want them to know that even when everything seems hopeless, even when the people you trust betray you, there are still others who will fight for the truth. And I want them to know that sometimes the most loyal friend you'll ever have is the one who can't speak, but will never stop trying to protect you." As if in response to her words, Kaiser stood up and moved closer to her wheelchair, his shoulder pressing against her leg in a gesture of comfort and solidarity. The cameras captured the moment, and Sarah knew that image would be replayed on news programs across the country. The disabled veteran and her faithful dog, survivors of a betrayal that had nearly destroyed them both. "Will you be returning to military service?" asked another reporter. Sarah shook her head. "My fighting days are over, but Kaiser and I are going to start a new mission. We're going to work with other veterans who've been failed by the system, help them find their voices, make sure their stories are heard. Because the real tragedy of Operation Lazarus isn't what happened to me. It's what happened to all the soldiers who died without anyone knowing the truth about their sacrifice." The press conference continued for another 20 minutes, but Sarah's attention drifted to the crowd of people gathering beyond the media circus. Veterans in worn fatigues, families holding photographs of fallen soldiers, protesters carrying signs demanding justice for military corruption. These were her people, the community that had sustained her through her darkest hours and would continue to need her voice in the battles ahead. As the reporters finally began to disperse and the camera crews packed up their equipment, Sarah found herself alone on the courthouse steps with Kaiser and her legal team. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the plaza, and for the first time in months, she felt something approaching peace. "What now?" asked Rebecca Stone, gathering her papers into a briefcase. Sarah looked down at Kaiser, who was watching the crowd with the alert but relaxed posture of a soldier who had completed his mission but remained ready for whatever came. "Next. Now we go home," she said, "and we figure out how to live with what we've learned." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah knew that home wasn't a place anymore. It was the bond between a woman and her dog, the trust between soldiers who had seen too much and survived anyway, the knowledge that truth had a way of surfacing, even when powerful people tried to bury it. The real work was just beginning. 2 weeks later, Arlington National Cemetery. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Arlington like the breath of ghosts, softening the edges of the white headstones that stretched in perfect rows toward the horizon. Sarah Martinez navigated her wheelchair along the paved path, Kaiser padding silently beside her, both of them drawn by a pilgrimage they'd needed to make since the moment the truth had finally emerged. They stopped first at the grave of Lieutenant Colonel David Morrison, the man she'd known as James Blackwood, whose headstone now bore his real name and the truth about his service. The inscription was simple but profound. He died twice for his country and lived for justice. Sarah placed a small American flag at the base of the headstone, her fingers trembling as she arranged the red, white, and blue fabric. "I'm sorry I never knew who you really were," she whispered. "I'm sorry you had to carry that burden alone." Kaiser lowered his head and sniffed the earth around the grave, his tail dropping to half-mast in the posture of a dog, paying respects to a fallen comrade. Even he seemed to understand that this was more than just another cemetery visit. This was a reckoning with the past, a moment to honor the man who had died trying to protect the truth. From the grave, they moved to the section of Arlington reserved for military working dogs, where a small memorial garden honored the K-9 units that had served alongside American soldiers in conflicts around the world. Here Sarah had commissioned a special plaque, not for a dog who had died, but for all the four-legged warriors who had served with distinction and lived to tell their stories. The inscription read, "To Kaiser and all military working dogs, faithful, companions who see the truth when humans are blind, who protect when others betray, who love without condition and serve without question. Their loyalty is our salvation, our salvation." As Sarah read the words aloud, Kaiser's ears perked up at the sound of his name. He looked up at her with those intelligent amber eyes, and she could swear she saw something like understanding there, not just the comprehension of a well-trained animal, but the deep emotional intelligence of a creature who had witnessed the best and worst of human nature and had chosen to remain faithful anyway. "You saved me," she said, reaching down to stroke his head. "Not just in that parking garage, but every day for 8 years, when I wanted to give up, when the pain was too much, when I thought the world had forgotten what honor meant. You were there to remind me." Behind them, footsteps crunched on the gravel path. Sarah turned to see General Hayes approaching, accompanied by a tall man in dress uniform whose chest displayed the ribbons and medals of a decorated career. His hair was silver gray, his face weathered by years of command, but his eyes held the same mixture of pain and determination that Sarah recognized in her own reflection. "Ms. Martinez," General Hayes said quietly. "I'd like you to meet General Robert Chen, Michael's father." Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. The last name should have been a warning, but the man standing before her bore no resemblance to the cold-eyed traitor who had orchestrated so much death and betrayal. This was a career soldier whose son had dishonored everything he'd spent his life defending. "General Chen," Sarah said carefully, uncertain how to respond to the father of the man who had nearly destroyed her life. The older man's face was etched with grief and shame. "Ms. Martinez, I came here to apologize, not as a general, but as a father whose son became a monster. I failed to raise him with the values that should define a soldier, and that failure led to the deaths of good people." Sarah studied his face, seeing the genuine anguish there. "Sir, you're not responsible for your son's choices. He made his own decisions, chose his own path." "Perhaps," General Chen replied, "but I wanted you to know that there are still people in uniform who believe in honor, who understand that the oath we take means something. Michael's betrayal doesn't represent the army. It represents the worst of what we can become when we forget why we serve." Kaiser, who had been watching the exchange with typical canine attention to human emotion, suddenly approached General Chen and sat down directly in front of him. The old soldier looked down at the German shepherd, his weathered features softening slightly. "He's a beautiful animal," General Chen said. "I've read his service record. Exemplary performance, multiple commendations, saved dozens of lives. He's more of a soldier than my son ever was." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at the roar. Pain in the general's voice. "Kaiser judges people by their actions, not their family connections. If he's comfortable with you, it's because he sees something good." General Chen knelt down slowly, his dress uniform creaking with the movement, and extended his hand toward Kaiser. The dog sniffed his fingers, then allowed himself to be petted, his tail wagging slightly at the attention from someone who understood the weight of military service. "What will you do now?" General Hayes asked Sarah. Sarah looked around the cemetery, at the endless rows of headstones marking the final resting places of men and women who had died for their country. Some had fallen in battle, others had been betrayed by the very people they'd trusted to lead them, but all of them had served with honor, had believed in something greater than themselves. "We're going to continue serving," she said finally, "not in uniform, but in our own way. There are too many veterans who come home broken, who don't know how to find their place in a world that doesn't understand what they've been through. Kaiser and I are going to help them remember that their service meant something, that their sacrifices weren't in vain." "And Phillips," General Hayes asked, "are you concerned about the trial?" Sarah shook her head. "Phillips is facing charges for treason, murder and conspiracy. The evidence against him is overwhelming, and he's lost his leverage now that the truth about Operation Lazarus is public. He'll spend the rest of his life in prison, and that's exactly what he deserves. But as she spoke the words, Sarah realized that her anger toward Phillips had faded, replaced by something closer to pity. The man had been so consumed by greed and power that he'd lost sight of everything that made life worth living: loyalty, honor, the simple satisfaction of doing the right thing even when it was difficult. "What about Michael?" General Chen asked quietly. "What happens to him?" General Hayes consulted her notes. "He's been charged with treason, murder, and faking his own death to avoid prosecution. The military tribunal begins next month. Given the evidence, he's looking at life in prison at minimum, possibly the death penalty." General Chen nodded slowly, the weight of his son's crimes settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. "It's what he deserves. I wish I could understand how he became that person." Sarah reached out and touched the old general's arm. "Sometimes people choose evil, sir, not because of how they were raised or what they experienced, but because they decide that their own desires matter more than other people's lives. That's not a failure of parenting. That's a failure of character." As the morning sun burned away the mist and revealed the full scope of Arlington's memorial landscape, the 4 humans and 1 dog stood in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about sacrifice, betrayal, and the price of justice. Around them, the eternal city of the dead bore witness to their small moment of reconciliation, their shared commitment to honor those who had fallen and to ensure that their sacrifices would not be forgotten. Finally, General Chen straightened to his full height and saluted, not to his fellow officers but to Kaiser, the military working dog who had served with more honor than his own son. Kaiser, sensing the solemnity of the moment, sat at attention, his amber eyes fixed on the general's face. "Thank you," General Chen said simply. "Thank you for serving with honor when others failed to do so." As the 2 generals departed, leaving Sarah and Kaiser alone among the headstones, she felt a sense of closure that had been missing from her life for months. The truth was finally out, justice was being served, and the conspiracy that had killed so many good soldiers was finally being brought to light. But more than that, she had her faithful companion back. The dog who had never stopped believing in her innocence, who had risked everything to expose the truth, who had shown her that loyalty was still possible in a world that seemed to reward betrayal. "Come on, boy," she said, beginning to wheel herself back toward the cemetery entrance. "Let's go home." Kaiser fell into step beside her wheelchair, his head high, his tail wagging with the confident satisfaction of a mission accomplished. Behind them, the headstones stood silent witness to their departure, marking the end of one chapter in their lives and the beginning of another. The real work was just beginning, helping other veterans, fighting for justice, making sure that the truth would always find a way to surface, no matter how powerful the people trying to bury it. But for the first time in months, Sarah felt ready for that challenge. She had Kaiser by her side, and together they were unstoppable. 6 months later, Veterans Community Center, Los Angeles. The community center buzzed with quiet conversation and the soft clicking of canes and wheelchairs as dozens of veterans gathered for the monthly meeting of the Martinez Foundation, an organization dedicated to supporting military personnel who had been failed by the system they'd sworn to protect. Sarah sat at the front of the room, Kaiser lying peacefully at her feet, both of them watching as men and women in various stages of physical and emotional recovery shared their stories. These were the forgotten casualties of America's wars, soldiers who'd come home to bureaucratic nightmares, veterans whose disabilities had been ignored, families whose loved ones had died under suspicious circumstances that were never properly investigated. "The thing about betrayal," Sarah was saying to the group, "is that it makes you want to stop trusting anyone. It makes you want to build walls, to assume that everyone has an agenda, to believe that loyalty is just a word people use to manipulate you." She paused, looking around the room at faces that reflected her own journey through darkness and back toward the light. "But I learned something important from my partner here," she continued, reaching down to scratch Kaiser's ears. "I learned that loyalty isn't about being naive or blind to danger. It's about choosing to believe in something bigger than yourself, even when that choice makes you vulnerable." Kaiser opened his amber eyes and looked up at her, his tail thumping. softly against the floor. In the month since the trial, he'd returned to his old self, alert, confident, and devoted to the woman who had given his life purpose. But there was something new in his demeanor now, a kind of wisdom that came from having seen the worst of human nature and still choosing to love. "Kaiser could have given up on me," Sarah continued, "when I was convicted, when it looked like I was going to die for a crime I didn't commit, when everyone else had written me off. He could have accepted that his human was lost and moved on with his life. But he didn't. He kept fighting, kept believing, kept looking for the truth even when no one else would listen to him." An elderly veteran in the front row raised his hand. "Ms. Martinez, how do we know when it's worth fighting and when it's time to let go?" Sarah smiled, the expression transforming her face from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful. "You fight when it matters, and you let go when it doesn't. The trick is knowing the difference. Kaiser taught me that some things, loyalty, honor, the truth, are always worth fighting for, even when the odds are impossible." As the meeting concluded and the veterans began to file out, many of them stopped to pet Kaiser or to shake Sarah's hand.